The merciless Arizona sun beat down on Clara Thompson as she dragged herself across the barren landscape. 3 days without water had left her lips cracked and bleeding, her once vibrant blue eyes now sunken and dull. The attack on her wagon had come without warning bandits who took everything, including her husband's life, leaving her for dead with a bullet wound in her side. Blood had soaked through her torn dress, the fabric now stiff and brown. Each step sent waves of agony through her body, but Clara refused to die in this godforsaken wilderness. The daughter of pioneers, she had survival in her blood, even if that blood was now running dangerously thin. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, though she had no destination in mind. The distant mountains seemed to mock her with their unreachable presence. When her legs finally gave out, Clara collapsed onto the hard-packed earth. The vultures had been circling for hours, patient observers waiting for the inevitable. As consciousness began to slip away, she thought she glimpsed a figure on horseback approaching through her blurred vision. A hallucination, surely her mind's final comfort before the end. But the shadow grew larger, more defined. A tall man astride a chestnut stallion, his face obscured by the brim of a weathered hat. He dismounted with fluid grace that belied his imposing stature, kneeling beside her broken form. Clara tried to speak, but her parched throat produced only a rasp. The stranger's calloused hands gently lifted her, examining the wound with methodical care. His eyes, a striking amber like autumn leaves, met hers, communicating a silent promise. Not once did he speak. With surprising tenderness, he lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her to keep her secure. Clara's head lolled against his chest as he urged the stallion forward, her consciousness fading in and out with the rhythm of hoofbeats. Hours passed in a delirious haze before they arrived at a modest cabin nestled against a rocky hillside. The stranger carried her inside, placing her on a simple bed. He worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning her wound with a concoction that smelled of herbs and whiskey. The pain made her cry out, but still he remained silent, his face a mask of concentration. When fever took hold that night, Clara's dreams were filled with the horrors she'd witnessed. Her husband Thomas falling beneath a hail of bullets, the bandits' cruel laughter as they left her to die. Through it all, the silent cowboy remained vigilant, cooling her brow with damp cloths, forcing small sips of water between her lips. By dawn, Clara's fever had broken, though weakness still claimed her body. Her eyes fluttered open to find the stranger watching her from a chair beside the bed, his gaze intense yet unreadable. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice barely audible. He said nothing, simply rising to fetch her a cup of water. When she tried again to question him, he shook his head slightly, tapping his throat before making a cutting motion with his hand. "You can't speak?" Clara realized aloud. The man nodded once, his expression unchanging. Over the following days, as Clara's strength gradually returned, she observed her silent savior. His movements were deliberate, economical. Despite his intimidating size, there was a gentleness to him that she found reassuring. On the wall hung a worn-wanted poster, not for him, but for a notorious gang leader named Cassidy. The reward was substantial. One evening, as they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew, Clara found a slate and chalk near the fireplace. She offered them to him. "Will you tell me your name?" she asked. He hesitated before taking the items, his script flowing. "And educated despite his rugged appearance, Ethan." "Thank you for saving me, Ethan. I'm Clara Thompson." He nodded, then wrote, "Rest. Tomorrow will be difficult." "What happens tomorrow?" His response was simple. "We remove the bullet." Clara's hand instinctively went to her bandaged side, fear gripping her heart. The wound had been temporarily dressed, but the bullet remained lodged within her. Ethan's gaze held no judgment, only a question: did she have the courage? As night fell and the cabin grew dark save for the flickering firelight, Clara watched. Ethan methodically arranged his tools. A knife heated in the flames until it glowed red, clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey, and various herbs she didn't recognize. His preparation was meticulous, his focus absolute dot in those quiet hours before what might be her last night alive. Clara found herself studying the man who had become her unexpected guardian. His weathered hands spoke of years of hard work, while a long scar trailing from his jaw down his neck perhaps explained his silence. There was pain in his eyes, not physical, but the deeper kind that comes from lost Dot. As if sensing her scrutiny, Ethan looked up, their eyes meeting across the room. In that moment, Clara understood that while he might not have a voice, his silence spoke volumes. Whatever happened tomorrow, she was no longer alone in her struggle to survive. Chapter 2. Silent Stian dawn broke with cruel clarity, illuminating the cabin and the task that lay ahead. Ethan had prepared everything meticulously boiled water, clean instruments, bandages torn from what appeared to be his own spare shirt. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as he approached with the slate. Ready? He had written. Clara nodded, though fear threatened to overwhelm her. Will it hurt terribly? She asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Ethan didn't lie with false comfort. He simply wrote, yes, but necessary. He offered her a leather strap to bite down on and a generous pour of whiskey. Clara drank deeply, grimacing at the burn, but welcoming the warmth that spread through her veins. As the alcohol began to dull her senses, Ethan positioned her on her side, exposing the inflamed wound. What followed was agony unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. Despite the whiskey, she felt every movement of Ethan's knife as he reopened the wound. Her screams filled the cabin as he probed for the bullet, his face a mask of concentration. Through tear-filled eyes, she watched his hands steady, sure, moving with purpose. When the metal finally clinked against a tin pan, Clara's consciousness was already fading. Ethan worked quickly to clean and stitch the wound, his movements practiced and precise. Before darkness claimed her completely, she felt his hand briefly squeeze hers. Silent promise that the worst was over. Clara woke hours later to find Ethan dozing in the chair beside her bed, his usually vigilant posture softened by exhaustion. In sleep, the hard lines of his face eased, revealing a man younger than she had first thought, perhaps 35, with flecks of gray only just beginning to appear at his temples. When he woke and found her watching him, no embarrassment crossed his features. He simply checked her forehead for fever, nodded with satisfaction, and went to prepare a thin broth that would be all her stomach could handle. As days passed, and Clara's strength slowly returned, a routine developed between them. Ethan would leave at dawn to hunt or tend to his horse, returning by midday. Clara gradually took on small tasks first, sitting up independently, then standing, eventually helping with simple chores. Though pain still accompanied every movement, each day brought improvement. They developed a language of their own, part gestures, part written words on the slate, part unspoken understanding. Clara learned that Ethan had lived alone in this cabin for nearly 5 years. The wanted poster was his focus. The man pictured had led the gang responsible for something Ethan couldn't or WOUL DN single quotes T-explain. One afternoon, while sorting through herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, Clara found a small wooden box tucked on a high shelf. Inside lay a silver locket containing the portrait of a beautiful young woman and a small girl with Ethan's amber eyes. When he returned and found her with it, his expression darkened not with anger, but with profound grief. That night, he wrote more than he ever had before. My wife, Rebecca, daughter Sarah, killed by Cassidy's gang 7 years ago. I tried to fight. They cut my throat, left me for dead. Clara's hand covered her mouth as understanding dawned. That's why you can't speak. He nodded, then wrote, Doctor saved my life. Voice gone forever. And you've been hunting Cassidy ever since? Justice, he wrote simply. Revenge, Clara corrected gently. Ethan studied her for a long moment before adding, both. The revelation created a new dimension to their quiet coexistence. Clara now understood the demons that drove him, recognized the purpose behind his solitary life. She also realized that her presence had disrupted the pattern of his days yet. He had chosen to save her, to care for her. Despite the inconvenience to his mission. As Clara's recovery progressed, she began to venture outside the cabin. The surrounding landscape was harsh, but beautiful rugged hills dotted with juniper trees. A small creek running nearby providing precious water. Ethan had chosen his isolation well. The cabin was nearly impossible to spot from a distance, tucked against the hillside with only a thin trail of smoke from the chimney to betray its existence. One evening, as they sat on the small porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Clara found the courage to ask the question that had been growing in her mind. What will happen to me when I'm fully healed? She wrote on the slate, passing it to him. Ethan's expression remained unreadable as he considered her words. Finally, he wrote, Your choice. Town is 3 days' ride. Can take you when you're stronger. The answer should have relieved her of course she would return to civilization. Yet Clara felt an unexpected hollowness at the thought of leaving this quiet existence, of saying goodbye to the silent man who had saved her life. And if I wanted to stay longer? She asked hesitantly. Surprise flickered briefly across Ethan's face before he controlled it. Dangerous. He wrote, Cassidy's men still search for me. I've already faced danger, Clara replied with newfound steadiness. And I owe you my life. That night, a storm rolled in from the mountains, lightning illuminating the cabin in brief, brilliant flashes. As thunder shook the walls, Clara found herself afraid not of the elements, but of the future that awaited her. The town Ethan mentioned would offer safety, perhaps, but what else? A widow with nothing to her name, she would likely end up in service or worse. Here, in this simple cabin with this silent, wounded man, she had found something unexpected, not just recovery, but purpose. The realization was as sudden and illuminating as the lightning outside. She didn't want to leave. Chapter 3. Dangerous TRUT after the bullet's removal. Clara stood at the edge of the creek, washing clothes with a vigor that would have been impossible days earlier. Her body was healing remarkably well under Ethan's care, the wound now a tight, pink scar rather than the angry red gash it had been. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. Visitors were unheard of at Ethan's isolated cabin. Dropping the wet garments, Clara hurried back up the path, heart pounding. Ethan emerged from the trees before she reached the cabin, his expression urgent as he gestured for her to hide. Without question, Clara slipped into the root cellar Ethan had shown her, an emergency shelter dug beneath the cabin floor, accessible through a trapdoor hidden under a rug. From her hiding place, she could hear muffled voices above men's voices, harsh and demanding. We know you're tracking Cassidy, one said. Sheriff Blackwood wants to see you in town. Says it's important. Clara couldn't hear Ethan's response there. Would be none, of course, but the men continued. Got some information about his whereabouts. Seems your old friend's planning something big in Silver Creek. Sheriff thinks you might want in on catching him. The conversation continued briefly before the men departed. When Ethan opened the cellar door minutes later, his expression was troubled. On the slate, he wrote, Must go to town. Stay here. Is it about Cassidy? Clara asked. Climbing out of her hiding place, Ethan nodded, then added, Opportunity I've waited for. Let me come with you, Clara said impulsively. His response was immediate. Too dangerous. I need supplies anyway, she argued. And staying here alone might be more dangerous if those men return. Ethan's reluctance was clear, but Clara's logic was sound. By nightfall, they had prepared for the journey. Clara, wearing men's clothing Ethan had altered to fit her smaller frame, her hair tucked beneath a hat. Less conspicuous, he had written. Safer. They set out at dawn, Clara riding the chestnut stallion while Ethan led them on foot. The journey would take longer this way, but Clara was still too weak to walk such distances, and the horse couldn't carry both of them efficiently for long periods. As they traveled, Clara observed how Ethan constantly scanned their surroundings, his hand never far from the revolver at his hip. In these open spaces, his silence seemed less a disability and more an asset. He moved like a ghost across the landscape, reading signs invisible to her eyes. By nightfall, they had covered significant ground. Setting up camp in a sheltered ravine, Ethan built a small, smokeless fire. As they shared jerky and hardtack, Clara studied his face in the flickering light. "Tell me about Cassidy," she wrote on the slate. Ethan hesitated before responding. "William Cassidy, former Union soldier, now leads the most ruthless gang in the territory. And he's responsible for your family's death?" The pain that flashed across Ethan's face made Clara regret her bluntness, but he wrote, "Yes, we were settlers. New farm. Cassidy wanted our land for access to the river. When I refused to sell, they came at night." The simple words couldn't possibly convey the horror of that night, but Clara could see it etched in the tightness around Ethan's eyes, the white-knuckled grip on his pencil. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "Long ago now," he wrote, though his expression belied the words. "Is that why you became a bounty hunter?" "Not officially," he responded. "Just hunting Cassidy." The conversation lapsed into silence as they prepared for sleep, Ethan insisting on taking the first watch despite Clara's protests. When he finally woke her for her turn, the moon was high overhead, casting silver light across the desert landscape. Sat with her back against a boulder, Ethan's spare revolver heavy in her lap. She had never fired a gun before meeting him, but he had insisted on teaching her the basics during her recovery. Now, as she watched his sleeping form, she wondered at the strange turns her life had taken. A month ago, she had been Clara Thompson, wife to a freight driver, headed west for a new beginning. Now she was a widow, rescued by a silent avenger, headed toward a confrontation with dangerous men. The old Clara would have been terrified. This new version of herself, hardened by loss, strengthened by survival, felt something closer to resolve. Dawn found them already moving, the small town of Silver Creek appearing on the horizon by midday. As they approached, Ethan signaled for them to stop, writing hastily, "From here, we're strangers. Safer for you. I meet sheriff. You get supplies. Meet at livery stable at sundown." Clara nodded her understanding, though anxiety knotted her stomach at the thought of separation. Ethan's next words surprised her. "If I don't come, ride back to cabin. Wait 2 days. If still no return, take horse and go east to Tucson." "You expect trouble," she stated rather than asked. His reply was characteristically direct, always. They entered Silver Creek separately, Clara riding in first while Ethan waited behind. The town was larger than she expected, a main street lined with businesses, side streets filled with modest homes, a church steeple rising above it all. After weeks in the wilderness with only Ethan for company, the bustle of humanity felt overwhelming. Following their plan, Clara headed to the general store, purchasing supplies with money Ethan had given her. As she haggled over the price of coffee, she overheard 2 men discussing the arrival of Cassidy's boys at the saloon the previous night. "Just scouts," one said. "Word is Cassidy himself arrives tomorrow for the bank shipment." Clara's heart raced. This information might be valuable to Ethan. Finishing her transaction quickly, she debated whether to seek him out immediately or wait as planned. Caution one drawing attention to their connection could be dangerous for both of them. As she loaded her purchases onto Ethan's horse, a voice behind her made her freeze. "Well now, ain't you a pretty thing to be handling such business alone?" Clara turned to find a man leaning against the hitching post, his unshaven face split by a predatory smile. Something in his eyes made her blood run cold. "My husband's meeting me shortly," she lied, keeping her voice steady. "That so?" The man pushed away from the post, stepping closer. "Funny, because I'd swear I've seen this horse before. Belongs to a man who's been causing my boss some trouble." Clara's hand moved imperceptibly toward the revolver hidden beneath her coat, but before she could reach it, another man appeared behind the first. "That's enough, Jenkins," came an authoritative voice. "Leave the lady be." The newcomer wore a sheriff's badge, his weathered face stern as he faced down the would-be harasser. Jenkins backed away with a sneer. "Just making conversation, Sheriff," he said before sauntering away. The sheriff turned to Clara, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you complete your business and move along. Some unsavory types in town these days." "Thank you, Sheriff," Clara managed, her heart still pounding as he walked away. Clara realized with growing dread that Jenkins had recognized Ethan's horse. Their careful planning was already unraveling, and Ethan needed to be warned. Chapter 4. New Bijanaisi's finding the sheriff's office wasn't difficult. A square building with barred windows near the center of town. Clara approached cautiously, peering through the dusty glass. Inside, she could see Ethan seated across from a balding man who must be Sheriff Blackwood. Their conversation appeared tense, the sheriff gesturing emphatically while Ethan's responses came via written notes. Clara was debating how to intervene when movement across the street caught her eye. 3 men, Jenkins among them, were watching the sheriff's office with obvious interest. One carried a rifle partially concealed beneath his coat. Instinct told Clara that waiting until sundown was no longer an option. She needed to warn Ethan immediately, but approaching directly would only confirm their connection to the watching men. Thinking quickly, she purchased a small bottle of whiskey from the saloon, then deliberately staggered toward the sheriff's office, playing the part of an intoxicated drifter. When she stumbled through the door, both men looked up in surprise. "Sheriff," she slurred, "there's trouble brewing." Then, as if noticing Ethan for the first time, she affected greater surprise. "Well, if it ain't the silent stranger from the creek road. Fancy meeting you here." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, perceiving her act, but not yet understanding its purpose. "Ma'am, this is official business," the sheriff began, rising from his chair. "Official, is it?" Clara continued, moving closer to Ethan. "Well, your official business is being watched by 3 men. Across the street, one's got a rifle." The transformation in both men was immediate. The sheriff reached for his shotgun, while Ethan's hand moved to his revolver. "Cassidy's men?" the sheriff asked quietly. Ethan nodded, scribbling quickly. "Trap. Cassidy not coming. Drawing me out." The sheriff cursed under his breath. "My information came from a stranger who rode in yesterday. Should have been more suspicious." A shot shattered the window, sending glass spraying across the room. Clara dropped to the floor as Ethan overturned the heavy oak desk, creating cover. The sheriff wasn't as fortunate. The second shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him against the wall. "Get him behind the desk," Clara shouted to Ethan. Already moving toward the fallen lawman. Together, they dragged the sheriff to safety as bullets splintered the wooden door. Outside, shouts indicated the town was coming alive to the violence, some fleeing, others perhaps preparing to assist. Ethan pressed his slate into Clara's hands, writing hurriedly. "Back door. Get to horse. Ride hard for cabin. I'm not leaving. You, Clara insisted, checking the sheriff's wound. The bleeding was steady, but not immediately life-threatening. The frustration on Ethan's face was clear as he wrote again. Not negotiable. Sheriff needs doctor. You need safety. And you need someone to watch your back, Clara countered, drawing the revolver he had given her. I'm staying. Their standoff was interrupted by a voice from outside. Kingsley, we know you're in there. Time to finish what started 7 years ago. Clara saw Ethan's jaw tighten at the name, his full name, she realized, and at the reference to his family's murder. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, she understood his fear was not for himself, but for her. He had already lost everyone he loved to these men. He couldn't bear to lose another. I'll help the sheriff, she conceded softly, but promise me you won't face them alone. Before he could respond, the back door burst open. A burly man with a scarred face charged in, gun raised. Ethan moved with startling speed, tackling the intruder before he could fire. The two men crashed into the wall. Grappling for control of the weapon, Clara aimed her revolver but couldn't risk hitting Ethan. Instead, she grabbed the sheriff's shotgun, waiting for an opening. When it came a brief separation as the men slammed against a cabinet, she fired. The blast caught the attacker in the leg, sending him howling to the floor. Ethan disarmed him swiftly, then turned to Clara with a look of astonishment that might have been comical under different circumstances. 2 more outside, she reminded him, trying to steady her shaking hands. Ethan nodded, then did something unexpected. He pulled her close, pressing his forehead briefly against hers. A wordless thank you, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. The next minutes passed in a blur of gunfire and strategy. Using hand signals, Ethan directed Clara to cover the shattered window while he positioned himself by the front door. When Jenkins and his remaining companion attempted to rush the office from different directions, they found themselves caught in crossfire. Jenkins fell to Clara's careful shot through his shoulder. The other man retreated under Ethan's fire, only to run directly into a group of townspeople who had harmed themselves. To support their sheriff, as quickly as it had erupted, the violence ended. In the sudden quiet, Clara became aware of the sheriff's labored breathing behind her. Doctor, she said urgently to the gathering crowd, he's been shot. Hours later, with the sheriff under the doctor's care and the 3 attackers locked in their own jail cells, Clara and Ethan sat on a bench outside the hotel. The townspeople had hailed them as heroes, insisting they stay as guests of honor, but both felt the discomfort of unwanted attention. What happens now? Clara asked as darkness fell over Silver Creek. Ethan wrote slowly. Cassidy will know his men failed. He'll come himself eventually, so the danger isn't over. Never truly ends, he acknowledged. Then, after a pause, but something else began today. Clara looked at him questioningly. Saw you differently, he wrote. Not just someone to protect. A partner. The word made Clara's heart beat faster. Is that what we are? Partners? Ethan studied her face in the fading light before writing. Could be more, if you wanted. The simple statement held profound meaning, an offer not just of companionship, but of a future together. Clara thought of her previous life, now lost forever, and of the new strength she had found in herself through survival and through Ethan's silent guidance. I would like that, she said softly. Very much. His smile, rare and transformative, warmed her more than any fire could have. They returned to Ethan's cabin 3 days later, the journey companionable, despite the lingering awareness of danger. Cassidy remained at large, a shadow that would continue to hang over them. But as they crested the final ridge and the small structure came into view, Clara felt a surprising sensation. Homecoming. That evening, as they sat on the porch, Watching stars appear in the vast desert sky, Ethan handed her his slate. On it, he had written more words than she had ever seen from him at once. 7 years of silence and solitude, hunting death instead of building life, and found you, dying in the desert. Saving you saved something in me too. Don't know what future holds. Cassidy's still out there. Danger always near. But for first time since I lost my voice, I feel I have something to say, and someone who hears me. Clara took the chalk from his hand, writing beneath his words, "We are both beginning again. Together." As Ethan's hand found hers in the gathering darkness, Clara understood that true heroism wasn't always about grand gestures or final victories. Sometimes it was the quiet courage to save a stranger's life. Sometimes it was the strength to begin again after devastating loss. And sometimes it was the bravery to open one's heart when all logic argued against it. Their story was far from over. Cassidy's threat loomed, and the harsh realities of frontier life remained. But in finding each other, both had discovered something worth fighting for beyond mere survival or revenge. They had found a new beginning,